It may not seem like it given the current state of the genre, but wrestling games used to be a really big deal. They were some of the earliest examples of one-on-one fighting games back in the early days of gaming. And moving on to the N64 and PlayStation 1 eras, they provide each of those consoles with some of the best multiplayer experiences to be had. To celebrate the storied history of wrestling in video games, let's take a look back at the top 10 wrestling video games of all time. At their core, wrestling games are fighting games, but perhaps no game embraced the fighting game aspect quite as heavily as Saturday Morning Slam Masters. Developed by Capcom, Saturday Morning Slam Masters was shallow fun with awesome looking characters designed by Tetsuo Ohara of Fists of the North Star fame. It also incorporated wrestling quite nicely with short character entrances, a count-out victory condition, and the ability to utilize attacks from the top rope. The Fire Pro Wrestling series has a storied history dating all the way back to 1989, but its latest iteration, Fire Pro Wrestling World, is easily the best version to date. The relationship between Fire Pro Wrestling and other wrestling games has always had a Coke or Pepsi kind of feel to it, where wrestling fans largely preferred either one or the other due to Fire Pro Wrestling's unique control system and iconic isometric camera angle. It's not everyone's cup of tea, but Fire Pro Wrestling World's deep library of wrestling moves and created wrestlers is undeniably impressive and makes it worthy of a spot on this list. Wrestling is at its best when it embraces and revels in its absurdity, and no wrestling game did that better than WWF WrestleMania, the arcade game. Developed by the makers of NBA Jam, WWF WrestleMania the arcade game essentially did for wrestling what NBA Jam did for basketball. Undertaker would bust out gravestones to beat people over the head with, Razor Ramon could turn his arm into a literal razor, and Doink the Clown would attack with hand buzzers and comically oversized mallets. It was ridiculous arcade fun, and always a great spot to spend 25 cents back at a 90s arcade. Aki Corporation is a legend in the wrestling video game world, as you'll quickly learn via this list, and while WrestleMania 2000 isn't their best game, or their first game, it was the first time the developer was able to show what they're able to do with the WWF roster during a time when wrestling was at its peak, the Attitude Era. WrestleMania 2000 took the foundation of everything that was laid down in WCW vs NWO World Tour and Revenge and refined it, resulting in one of the best wrestling games of the N64 era. Sometimes in the world of anime video games, there's just a perfect matching of developer with anime property. It happened with Arc System Works and Dragon Ball Z with Dragon Ball FighterZ, and it also happened with Kinnikuman and Aki Corporation. Known in the US as Ultimate Muscle Legends vs. New Generation is the perfect blend of wrestling and fantasy. Featuring a combination of real-life wrestling holds, out-of-this-world super moves, and that tried-and-true Aki style of wrestling gameplay that centers around punches, grapples, and reversals. Also, there's Dick Van Dyke, which is just a fun thing to say. The WWE 2K series has been on such a downward trend over the last few years that it can be hard to remember the good times. But the good times were actually pretty great. WWE 2K14 marked the pinnacle of the series, as it was the wrestling swan song of the PS3/Xbox 360 era and contained years of iterations and improvements to the formula, culminating in one of the best traditional wrestling games of all time. Then WWE 2K15 stumbled through the wall like the Shockmaster, and 2K has been trying to put everything back together ever since. But that's beside the point. WWE 2K14 was peak WWE 2K, with a fantastic 30 years of WrestleMania mode, a plethora of match types, fantastic roster, and genuinely solid wrestling gameplay. An underrated gem, WWE AllStars is quite simply the best arcade wrestling game there's ever been. Developed by THQ San Diego and led by creative director Sal DeVita, who also worked on WWF WrestleMania the arcade game, WWE AllStars let go of any notion of realism or simulation and focused on the fun of wrestling. And the result was, shocker, a ridiculously fun wrestling game. But more than that, it was a smartly designed fighting game as well, with some of the coolest wrestling super moves there have ever been. SmackDown Here Comes the Pain is similar to WWE 2K14 in that it was kind of the culmination of years of improvements and represented the SmackDown series when it was at its best. Then developer Ukes decided to change things up with SmackDown vs. Raw, which was its own sub-series. But Here Comes the Pain will always be remembered as the peak of the core SmackDown line of games. Its fighting was fast-paced and incredibly satisfying, the game's dynamic usage of camera angles heightened the excitement of every move, there was an insane number of match types. You could throw weapons, you could stack tables, you could stack ladders on tables, and overall the game hit a perfect blend of simplicity and depth that wasn't quite matched in later years of the series. Def Jam Fight for New York represented perhaps the biggest departure from Aki's bread and butter combat system, but despite a greater focus on strikes and environmental interactables, Def Jam Fight for New York is still undeniably a wrestling game, albeit one that trades in the spandex superheroes of the wrestling ring for hip-hop stars like Redman, Method Man, and Snoop Dogg. Fight for New York was actually the second Def Jam wrestling game from Aki, and while the first game, Def Jam Vendetta, wasn't bad by any stretch, Fight for New York simply improves upon it in every way. It still holds up to this day, and if there's any justice in the world, one day we'll see it again in some form. What's so wonderful about WWF No Mercy is that despite everything it lacks in comparison to modern wrestling games, from commentary to flashy entrances to Titantron videos that don't look like scrambled porn, its fundamentals are so strong that it still holds up in the one area that matters most: gameplay. No Mercy simply feels amazing to play. On top of its stellar gameplay, No Mercy was also one of the most fully featured wrestling games on the market. It had a great story mode that branched like a visual novel depending on your wins and losses, an exhaustive create a wrestler mode, and an excellent roster consisting of just about every notable wrestler from the Attitude Era. No Mercy was the total package, and it helped cement the N64's legacy as one of the best consoles for wrestling games. And that's our list. What are some of your favorite wrestling games? Let us know in the comments, and for more top 10s, make sure to check out our video counting down the best PlayStation 2 games of all time. Thanks for watching, and for everything else, keep it here on IGN.